Good evening. On behalf of the chair, Dr. Karen Blair Brown, and the rest of the Happy Hour Committee, let me welcome you to another in our series of Happy Hour programs. My name is Bill Kennedy. I'm the president of the Cleveland branch. And once again, the Cleveland branch is honored to be presenting tonight's program. And on behalf of the Cleveland branch and the Happy Hour Committee, let me wish you all a very happy and healthy holiday season. Before we get started with tonight's program, a little bit of housekeeping. We will have a question and answer period at the end of tonight's lecture. If you have a question for our speaker, please put it in the chat feature at the bottom of your screen. I will be your interlocutor. There are too many of us this evening to open the floor to questions, but if you put your question in the chat feature, I will be reading them and monitoring them, and then we'll let Andrew know what your question is, and he will respond to you. Also, if you have an idea for a happy hour program, all of these programs are created or introduced or inspired by members of various branches. And if your branch has not yet sponsored a happy hour program, we welcome you to do so and hope that you will take advantage of that opportunity. Many of you are probably already going to a production of Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, or you will be watching one of the many versions that are offered every season on television, or you have an old VHS or a DVD of a favorite of yours that you'll be watching with your family. Many of you may not know that Dickens wrote many other Christmas stories in addition to A Christmas Carol. He wrote an annual Christmas story. And tonight our speaker is going to give us some background on Charles Dickens and his Christmas tales and the dark secret behind those Christmas tales. Was Charles Dickens the Victorian Voldemort? Our speaker is Andrew Halls, and he's coming to us tonight from England. It's about 10 o'clock in the evening there, so we thank him very much for staying up this late and sharing his information with us. Andrew has been interested in the work and life of Charles Dickens since he began reading English literature at Cambridge University as a very young man. For 23 years, he worked in education at two of the most prestigious and recognized and awarded schools in Britain. And in 2020, he was awarded an OBE from Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II as part of her New Year's honors list in the year 2020 for his service to education in Great Britain. We're very happy and pleased to welcome Andrew for tonight's program. Andrew.
Oh, thank you very, very much, Bill, and thank you everyone for coming along. So it was 180 years ago, almost to the day, in 6 days' time, that Dickens realized he had stumbled upon a Christmas golden goose, and it was one that would keep on giving until the end of his life. Christmas Carol transformed his stuttering success and turned him from being yesterday's wunderkind to a Victorian superstar and national treasure before the terms were invented. I'll just give you a quick idea of Dickens's career. You perhaps know his background. He came from a momentarily prosperous lower middle class home, which fell into extreme poverty. Dickens was sent to a boot polish factory to his endless shame and anger. At the age of 12, taken out of school, and so on and so on. He made himself into a writer, and so I won't go through his whole biography, but it is worth thinking how he lit up the literary skies of Great Britain and America like a fireball in the 1830s, and it came from almost nothing. He was a barely known jobbing writer, and he was asked to produce the incidental text to a series of illustrations drawn by an accomplished artist of the day called Robert Seymour. Seymour was very clear that he was going to write draw a set of sporting cartoons, and Dickens would simply do little more than some extended captions. Of course, he was not to realise the sort of character Dickens was, even as a young man. Pickwick Papers was born and sold comfortably for the first few issues, but Dickens immediately dominated, despite Seymour's assumption that Dickens was to be the junior partner. Dickens insisted his version of the narrative was to guide the pictures, not the other way round. In fact, he told Seymour to redraw Pickwick to match Dickens' vision. There were other aspects of the early drawings Dickens was not satisfied with. A meeting was held, the only time Seymour and the young, boundlessly confident novelist actually met. 2 days later, Seymour went into his shed and shot himself. Dickens employed a new artist. Pickwick went from strength to strength and became an extraordinary success. Dickens was instantly one of the most famous writers in England, aged just 24. Oliver Twist, Nicholas Nickleby, and The Old Curiosity Shop followed on its heels, all bringing ever vaster readerships, all published in regular episodes, either monthly or weekly. By the time The Old Curiosity Shop was nearing its climax, crowds apparently stood on New York Harbourside, awaiting the arrival of the latest episode in the steamship from England, shouting at the passengers on deck, "Is little Nell dead?" Not that they wanted her to be. Dickens had appeared to be the lion of literary London, effortlessly outselling all his competitors. And he had a mesmeric charm in person too. Early portraits show a handsome, almost feminine face, lustrous dark curls, hair worn rather longer than usual, with dark eyes that captivated and enchanted his readers and his fans. I wonder if we could see the second slide here. This is the portrait of Charles Dickens from 1842. So I'm just wondering if Stefan can put that picture up for us. There it is. And then, so here's the heroic young Dickens, beautiful painting of him. I think it was the frontispiece to Nicholas Nickleby, this painting. But then everything changed. This painting is 1842, but by then his success was beginning to diminish. Barnaby Rudge and Martin Chuzzlewit, published in 1841 and 1843, reflected Dickens' suddenly declining attraction. His American notes lost him many admirers in the States, as did Chuzzlewit, where in a way very typical of Dickens, he returned to the offensive against a country, America, which had greeted him to its shores with a frenzy of adulation. With sales of his latest book dropping 80% compared to The Old Curiosity Shop, his publishers reminded him of a penalty clause in their contract. His wife was pregnant with their 5th child. His extended family looked to Dickens to pay their debts. Dickens had been proud of his success to date. He liked to be wealthy, especially after the poverty of his youth. Some thought him flashy or a dandy, but most of all, he couldn't bear to be a fading star. He had to think of something. During a frenzied week in October 1843, he walked the streets of London throughout the night, as he did when he couldn't sleep, hammering out a story that would put him back at the top. He came up with the idea of a wicked miser, Scrooge, his gentle clerk, Bob Cratchit, his lovable family, Tiny Tim, and best of all, the 4 ghosts, starting with his partner, Marley, and then the 3 Christmas ghosts that visit Scrooge and redeem him. The short novella was published complete on the 19th of December and had sold out by Christmas Eve. It's never been out of print since then, nor out of favour. There are at least 10 versions of Christmas Carol being staged right now at theatres across London. With Christmas Carol, Dickens not only won back his name as the greatest story writer of the day, but he chanced upon a formula that would guarantee a financial windfall every Christmas until he died, or almost. The 5 Christmas books, all published as novellas, were very popular, far more then, with Dickens' mania at its lengthy peak, than now. They also began the process of weaving the name of Dickens into the fabric of Christmas itself. So much so that famously, when Dickens died, a little girl was heard to say to her poor tradesman father, "Dickens dead. Does that mean Father Christmas will die too?" In December 1844, he published The Chimes, his follow-up to Christmas Carol, and of course it sold extremely well. Other than its wonderful opening, describing the night wind blowing inside a church nave, the story is not really one of his best. However, written as it was in the so-called Hungry 40s, when widespread poverty, child abuse, prostitution and starvation held a terrible mirror up to Victorian industrial success, its head-on confrontation with the status quo and its staunch defence of the rights of the poor made for a powerful corrective to the utilitarianism of the time. Readers loved its compassion, sentimental though it seems to us today. 1 year later came The Cricket on the Hearth, dismissed by the Times as the babblings of genius in its dotage, but it doubled the sales of its predecessor, and Dickens was increasingly finding, for these winter's tales, that he was able to adopt a lower middle or middle-class narrative voice, creating a complicity with his ideal reader that made them and him feel comfortable with each other, and they loved it. You can hear the way Dickens is indulging in a narrative voice that voices the thoughts of his home-loving, sturdily Anglo-Saxon readers at Christmas time. Rhapsodizing over the sound of a kettle on a wintry hob, he writes of its shrill whistle, "Bless you, you might have understood it like a book, better than some books you and I could name, perhaps." English anti-intellectualism was alive and well in Dickens' most sentimental pieces. In 1846, The Battle of Life also underwhelmed critics and sold well, and I'll come back to that Christmas book later. And then finally in 1848, the last of the Christmas books was The Haunted Man. Dickens had wept over it, as he often did with his own fictional characters, partly because they were embodiments of himself, for whom he never lost a sense of almost pathological compassion. It sold less well, and Dickens immediately changed his approach. From 1850, almost until the end of his life, he wrote a much shorter Christmas story each year for a special festive edition of a weekly magazine that he edited for the last 20 years of his life. These Christmas numbers were incredibly successful, and Dickens wrote magnificently in many of them, I have to say. Often he collaborated with other popular authors like Wilkie Collins, and they'd write separate parts of a tale or different stories united by a theme or character for these Christmas editions. And by the 1860s, these editions were often selling over 300,000 copies. So the next slide is a cover of one Christmas special. Oh, sorry, that's I've forgotten that. That's the Ghost of Christmas Present from Christmas Carol. I'm sorry, Stefan. Can we go to the next slide, which is that one? There's the magazine that Dickens produced all the year round. It followed his Household Words seamlessly. The two magazines, replaced the earlier one, went on right up, in fact, beyond his death. His son took it over, this is the Christmas story from 1867, No Thoroughfare, she wrote with Wilkie Collins, and immediately became an extraordinarily popular play, incidentally. He always realized these stories of his would quickly end up in the theatre, whether he wanted them to or not, so he would normally arrange for a production that he supported. He had a number of motives in writing these Christmas stories. One was, of course, money. He was always excited by his own sales figures and the income that his sales generated. He never lost the need to see his success objectified and validated by income. Another motive was fame, but not the cold fame we might associate with modern celebrity, like living lives far, far removed from their feeble followers. Dickens wasn't like that. Dickens preferred the sort of fame the Christmas tales helped him to manufacture, a fame that really might as well be called love, a profound sense of kinship with his readers. Dickens wasn't just the most popular novelist of his day, but by far the most beloved. This public devotion was not only achieved through his novel writing, or indeed late in life his spectacular reading tours at home and in America. As referred to just now, he edited the inexpensive weekly magazine from 1850 until his death that brought Dickens, his values, his occasional pieces, his character into hundreds of thousands of homes every week. They were really extraordinary accomplishments by a man so busy in so many ways. He edited, he oversaw, he wrote for, he commissioned for his own journal. He always said well, you can see it there, it says all the year round, conducted by Charles Dickens, and he really did feel he was conducting an orchestra. I often wonder if Dickens was the first ever modern celebrity, self-made, swept along by giddying success, and in ways that were not always evident to his adoring public, somehow corrupted or damaged by exactly what he sought most. One reason he later killed himself on his reading tours, as he effectively did, was that the affection of his readers became a drug demanding ever stronger doses. Being physically amongst his devoted fans in his reading tours, hearing their laughter or tears as he read from Christmas Carol, his most popular reading, by the way, feeling their affection for him in real time, being mobbed on the stage, seeing queues for tickets stretch for nearly a mile overnight before the box office opened. Dickens loved all of that. One of Dickens' sons observed after his death that Dickens' own characters were often more real to him than his own children. I think his readers and the crowds who came to hear him were closer to him than his own children too. So, yes, money, fame, love, these were powerful motives behind his Christmas stories. But he had another motive that reveals itself in many of his Christmas tales, or at least I think it did. In his Christmas writings, Dickens found a way of sharing aspects of himself far more openly than ever before. His first Christmas story, as opposed to Christmas book, was a beautiful sketch called A Christmas Tree from 1850. It's autobiographical, full of intimate references to the fears and joys of his childhood. But Dickens had already realised he could take such light autobiographical flourishes into much darker territory, outlining in code or symbol aspects of his own tormented, complex, and many-selved character. In many of his Christmas works, Dickens himself is, of course, the ever-present narrator, taking the reader's arm in his just as firmly as the various ghosts, fairies, and crickets on the hearth lead protagonists towards redemption. At one point in A Christmas Carol, he writes that Scrooge finds himself face to face with the ghost of Christmas past, adding in a way entirely typical of his festive complicity with his reader, "As close to it as I am now to you, and I am standing in the spirit at your elbow." Dickens really did feel he was next to his reader. But Dickens is present in these stories not only as a friend and narrative guide, he's sharing some secrets about himself in the characters he describes. He hides fragments of a very dark soul within these and other stories, reminding me of Lord Voldemort in Harry Potter, dividing his soul among the 7 Horcruxes. Did Dickens hope these clues, these fragments would be found? Or did he delight in the fact that he was sure they never would be? I'm not sure. He loved the devotion he felt from his readers, but he had within him a contrary streak that was also repelled by it. He both loved and disdained the hero worship that he had himself encouraged through his populism, his sentimental twists of the heartstrings, his espousal of great causes, and his sold-out reading tours. Whether it was a secret self-loathing or a contempt for the ignorance of those who thought he really was the man he made them think he was, he used his own fiction to lay clues to the identity of an alternative Charles Dickens, a much crueler, more profoundly disillusioned man than his public image could ever suggest. A Christmas Carol does not at first glance seem to include clues to Dickens' own character. In fact, as Dickens well knew, to his devoted readers, Scrooge would have seemed the exact opposite to the public figure of their beloved novelist. No writer was ever so associated with warmth, compassion, generous sentiment as Dickens. However, by the end of 1843, when Christmas Carol was published 180 years ago, Dickens was changing. He had always possessed an ebullience, a delight in the moment that could be overwhelming, sometimes frenzied. Now, with a growing sense of power in all he did, a darkness arose within him, one that threatened to destroy both him and those close to him. Scrooge is not the opposite of Dickens. In some ways, he is the author's alter ego, but no reader of the time could see that clue. Scrooge, hard and sharp as a flint, is taken by the first spirit of Christmas, to observe a lonely boy reading near a feeble fire at a school where all the other boys have gone home for the holidays. Scrooge sat down and wept to see his forgotten self as he had used to be, because that little boy is Scrooge himself in the past. He's sensitive, bookish, neglected by his parents, loved only by his sister Fanny, who calls for him later in the story. In all of those respects, even the name of the sister, the young Scrooge, is identical to the young Dickens. And like the older Scrooge, Dickens could be hard and sharp as flint. He was good at not forgiving. As his sales roared to record levels, Dickens took his revenge on the publishers who had foolishly considered a financial penalty for the poor sales of Martin Chuzzlewit. He severed his contract with them for 15 years. And like Scrooge, though he always denied this, he did love money. On one occasion, after he had given a reading in Dublin, Ireland, someone came into the room and found Dickens rolling on the floor in the silver coins taken from the box office that evening. And brutality came as easily to Dickens as it did to Scrooge too. When, aged 45, Dickens fell in love with a teenage actress, he suddenly discovered he and his wife had been, to use his words, wonderfully unsuited to each other from the beginning. This was news to his poor wife, but he meant every word of it. He forced her from the family home, refused to allow 8 of their 9 children to live with her, barely to visit her, prohibited her from their weddings, and didn't trouble to inform her when one of their children died. Indeed, just as Scrooge exclaimed that poor people would be better off dying to decrease the surplus population in a parody of Malthus, Dickens once wrote of his frailest and most unsuccessful son, Sidney, "I begin to wish he were honestly dead." Incredible words for a father to write of his own son. And by the way, he wrote that to another of his sons, the boy's brother. His wish was fulfilled. The boy died exactly 2 years later. If you read Dickens' letters, you'll see many examples of exuberance, but many examples of cold detachment from the suffering of others, or of unforgiving, long-sustained grudges completely at odds with the repeated examples of forgiveness within so many of his Christmas narratives. I often wonder how his exiled wife felt as she read such sentiment at the very same time as she knew she was forever dead to him. Again and again, the Christmas stories make the deed of forgiveness almost the most important act a human being can commit. But Dickens would never forgive his wife. Forgive? She hadn't done anything wrong, but he had made himself believe she had, simply by not being the woman he wanted her to be. He never spoke to her after he exiled her from the house. He never met her again. He banned her from any family celebration, and he wrote just a few heartbreakingly aloof letters to her when he had to. By 1852, and now we go on to the next portrait. See if I got this right. Yes, here's Catherine. This is Dickens' wife. Dickens loved beautiful women, especially young ones. I suppose he wasn't the first husband to regret that his wife didn't remain beautiful. Not that he did, of course. But he couldn't tolerate the changes in Catherine. And by this time, Catherine had borne Dickens 10 children, 9 of whom had survived. He was impatient with her physical decline, mocked her appetite, and by 1857, with a mistress now in tow, Dickens was ready to inflict great pain on his loyal wife. I sometimes think Miss Havisham in Great Expectations was another Dickens Horcrux. Miss Havisham's cold and sustained revenge on men through Pip is remembered by readers as grotesque, almost cartoon-like. And yet Dickens' behaviour towards his wife is so enduringly cold and pitiless. I wonder if he used her as the recipient of his revenge on women. His own wife's abused loyalty thus became a means of somehow avenging, or at least laying the ghost of his never forgotten first love's betrayal. Never forgotten, never forgiven jilting by Maria Beadnell. Perhaps the vice-like control he exerted on his mistress, Ellen Ternan, was another illustration of this. Dickens' biographer, Claire Tomlin, called Ellen the invisible woman because she had no work, no friends, no identity, no purpose during their long affair, other than to be Dickens' unavowed mistress for 12 years. It's as if Dickens' love for women had to be first as teasing and then as destructive as Maria Beadnell's had been of him. So let's just see a picture of Maria Beadnell in the next slide. There she is. Now, a lot of Victorian pictures don't tend to suggest the attractiveness that the subject may well have had. But here you do see that pretty petted girl who totally captivated Dickens and teased him with his affection for nearly 3 or 4 years. And she broke his heart. And that reappears, by the way, as a theme in many of his books, that the silly, giddy, pretty, pet-like girl that he can't resist, or that the character can't resist, David Copperfield and Dora, for example, even though the male realizes that the Maria figure is never going to work for him long term. But Dickens never really forgot the effect of Maria on him when he was just 18. Dickens realized there were 2 of him. There was the public Dickens, revered across the country, the empire, across America, the Victorian upholder of hearth and home, the lionized radical and philanthropist, the beloved heart of English humour and compassion. And then there was the private Dickens, dark, mercurial, at times melancholic, and at other times, especially when he seduced Ellen Ternan, the demonic lover, exciting, dangerous, fierce, but destructive of those around him. Late in life, he saw a production of Gounod's Faust. Dickens was deeply struck by the scene where, with a casket of rich jewels, Mephistopheles helps Faust seduce the innocent Marguerite. He suddenly saw how pitiful he must seem. I could hardly bear the thing. he wrote, like a mournful echo of things in my breast. In his Christmas book, The Haunted Man, the main character, Redlaw, is also a divided self. He's haunted by a phantom that appears as an awful likeness of himself. This ghostly alter ego tempts him, Redlaw, to make a terrible mistake. And in a prefiguring of the film Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, Redlaw allows this spirit to burn away memory of sadness from his past, but then realizing that he's destroyed his own capacity to be human. Like Redlaw, perhaps Dickens suspected he too had lost the capacity for real compassion, or, to be more precise, compassion for anyone other than his own self. In 1855, he wrote to his friend and later biographer, John Forster, "A sense always comes crushing on me of one happiness I've missed in life, and one friend and companion I've never made." Nothing made Dickens sadder than his own sense of somehow not receiving everything from life that was his due. This preoccupation with his own disappointment surfaces throughout his Christmas tales and frequently provides them with their plots. The Haunted Man reveals another aspect of his hidden past. Through the voice of the phantom alter ego, Redlaw recalls how he was neglected in youth, strove and suffered, and struggled with parents who didn't love him. Dickens is channeling his own bitterness here. He also hints at that other lifelong scar I've alluded to just now, the way his first love, Maria, fascinated him, obsessed him, teased him, threw him head over heels in love with her, and then rejected him. In The Haunted Man, Redlaw's been jilted by his first love. That is the unbearable memory he seeks to destroy. And his last act ability to forgive both her and his rival is central to the story's inevitable happy ending. Dickens can never get enough of this theme of an unconsummated first love, always with the forsaken male as the betrayed party. It resurfaces in such Christmas stories as A Christmas Tree, briefly and far more substantially in Mugby Junction, the Christmas number for 1866. In this tale, a man called Jackson represents the lonely, drifting bachelor figure that populates some of Dickens' later work, such as Arthur Clenham in Little Dorrit. Like Dickens, Redlaw or Scrooge, Jackson recalls childhood's betrayals. A child who never had a childhood, a youth with a bitter sense of his namelessness, eternally wounded by the deceit of the only woman he'd ever loved. These are not remotely true or complete pictures of Dickens' own childhood, or even of his frustrated affair with Maria Beadnell, but for Dickens, they were his truth, and he was remorseless in expressing it in his fiction, using the Christmas stories to develop his autobiographical art. Other themes close to Dickens' heart and his own powerful sense of self appear repeatedly in the Christmas books. For example, 3 of the 5 Christmas books, The Chimes, Cricket on the Hearth, and The Battle of Life, feature exceptionally strong father-daughter relationships, although occasionally it's a bachelor or widower who effectively adopts a daughter. Dickens doted on his 2 daughters far more than on any of his 7 sons. He wanted their love to be for him. He jealously forbade either to visit their mother after the separation, and he wept into the left-behind wedding dress of his younger daughter when she finally married and left home, probably to escape him. Doting father-daughter affection is present too in such Christmas stories as Somebody's Luggage in 1862, Dr. Marigold, 1865, and Mugby Junction, 1866. In every case, the daughter's passion for the father or father figure is so intense it leaves the modern reader a little uneasy. Perhaps this reached its apotheosis in Our Mutual Friend, written the year before Dr. Marigold. In Our Mutual Friend, the beautiful Bella's relations with her henpecked father are more like those of a flirtatious pet with her lover. He loves to draw devoted sisters and especially sacrificial daughters who are essentially in love with their own fathers. And Bella Wilfer is the most unsettling example of that. Here, the male figure, Mr. Wilfer, is married to a desperately dull and complaining wife with no emotional connection with her husband or her children, just as Dickens had presented his poor wife to the world at the time of their separation, because he had incidentally published an explanation that was hugely uncomplimentary to poor Catherine and full of justification for himself. Quite shocking behaviour by Dickens. Bella performs the usual rescue mode of a loving daughter, but with a comical blurring of roles where she is at once daughter, wife, and mother. She speaks of her father as a beloved boy, endlessly ruffling his hair, or she pulls teasingly at his buttons. After she's taken him out for a secret lunch, she, quote, set him with his back against the door, tenderly took him by the ears as convenient handles for her purpose, and kissed him until he knocked the door with the back of his head. There are countless such descriptions. I'm sure he had in mind his closeness to his two daughters, especially Katie. Let's have a look at the next picture, please, Stefan, if we can. Yes, so there they are. Dickens reading and Katie and Mamie looking on. Dickens referred to Katie as Lucifer Box because she was so fiery. She was beautiful too, and you can imagine her being the inspiration for the lovely woman, as Bella always refers to herself when on her father's arm. The way Bella and her father do all they can to forget the gloomy existence of Bella's mother must have been further wish fulfillment by Dickens. Mr. Wilfer attends Bella's secret and simple wedding, but the mother has not been invited. Dickens attended his daughter Katie's sumptuous wedding, but the mother was not invited. Let's have a look at Katie, a woman of considerable beauty and strength of character. So if we change the slide, Stefan, there's Katie, painted by her second husband. Her first husband, whom she left Dickens' home to marry, was probably impotent, probably homosexual. They were happy as a couple, but it was an unsuccessful affair in some ways, and she married again. Another hidden horcrux found in many of Dickens' works, including the Christmas pieces, is the haunting memory of Dickens's beautiful and ethereal young sister-in-law, Mary. So not a daughter, but a sister-in-law. When Dickens married Catherine Hogarth in 1836, Dickens insisted her 15-year-old sister Mary move in with them too. That he was besotted with his wife's younger sister, Dickens did not hide, other than to present it as a form of sacred love. When Mary suddenly died, Dickens' grief was extreme, but the manner of her death remains a mystery. And here's a picture of Mary Hogarth. It's not a great picture. It's the only, pretty well, I think it is the only one we have of her. So if we can just go to the next slide. There's Mary. Within a year of the three of them moving in together, his sister-in-law Mary was dead. Dickens, our only witness to the event, says he heard a choking sound, ran into Mary's bedroom, and found her gravely and suddenly ill. Dickens held her in her arms. And as Claire Tomlin says in her biography, it's curious that in the 14 hours that led to her death, no doctor was able to make a diagnosis, provide, or even suggest any form of care. From his many letters about the incident, one would feel the key fact is that Dickens held her as she died. He was proud that she, quote, drank some brandy from my hand, like a dying pet. And the last words she spoke were of me, he also proudly wrote. He took a ring off the dead girl's finger, wore it for the rest of his life. He cut a lock of her hair. He kept all her clothes, which, as he wrote later, would moulder in their secret places. He bought her grave plot and planned to be buried beside her. This is all his wife's sister. How poor Catherine understood this, I've no idea. He was bitterly frustrated when a year later, Mary's brother tragically died too, and her parents begged Dickens to give up his space in the grave for her brother, which he did with great reluctance, by the way. Mary Hogarth appeared in his dreams hundreds of times. He was public in stating she was the person who understood him best and meant most to him. Strange words for a wife to hear said of her younger sister. And of course, she features in countless tales in disguised form. His Christmas book of 1846 was called The Battle of Life. It features a beautiful younger daughter, Marion, and a thoughtful older daughter, Grace. Both loved the same man, Alfred. Perceiving this, the lovely Marion, despite being the preferred choice of Alfred, disappears from the home and goes into hiding, appearing to have died, reappearing only once his older sister has married the man she loves, who, of course, Marion, the self-sacrificial younger sister, had also loved too. I wonder if the story of Marion suppressing her desire for a man she loved so that her older sister could take the prize in some way captures Dickens' tormented love for his wife's younger sister. We'll never fully understand the emotions Mary and Charles Dickens felt for each other. Did a forbidden love grow between them? And in his extraordinarily egotistic way, did Dickens think her death was Mary's beautifully selfless way of rescuing his marriage to her own sister? Of course, it wasn't long before Dickens imported another of his wife's younger sisters. She came to live with them too. And when he exiled his wife, he kept her sister, Georgina. And it's no surprise that rumours abounded of Dickens' relations with Georgina. So Dickens married Catherine, but he brought Mary into the home, who died, and then he brought Georgina, who then became, in many respects, senior to his wife in the household. She ran the household, in fact. And according to Dickens, she looked after the children because Catherine was unable to do so, again, according to Dickens. Although Dickens' Last Christmas Story was published in December 1867, 3 years before he died, he reverts to the theme of Christmas in his final unfinished novel. But here, the holy day is shaded by darkness. It's the day when it's discovered that Edwin Drood has disappeared, or most probably been murdered. By the time Dickens was writing The Mystery of Edwin Drood, he had abandoned his wife, as we know, lost patience with his children, and was now long established in his secret affair with Ellen Ternan. And it's about time we saw a picture of the woman that Dickens, well, controlled, certainly. Did he captivate her? I'm not sure. We haven't time to go into how he seduced Ellen, but he almost certainly was highly manipulative. Can we see the slide of the next slide? Thank you. There's Ellen Ternan. With Ellen, his double life reached its sad climax. He adopted a second identity, Charles Tringham, when he paid her visits at the anonymous houses where he would place her. In his final novel, The Mystery of Edwin Drood, the villainous John Jasper is also a divided man. Dickens never finished the book, but one of his plans apparently was for Jasper to discover that his own alter ego had committed Edwin Drood's murder. And there are many parallels between this villainous, wicked character and Dickens. He's intelligent. He takes opium for an agony that sometimes overcomes me, as Dickens did at that point in his life. Like Dickens, Jasper tries to seduce a teenager, Rosa Budd, still at school, not only through the power he holds over her as her music teacher, what we'd call grooming today, and the uncle of her betrothed, but with the mesmeric power of his mind. Hypnotic. Dickens, too, considered himself a gifted mesmerist, or hypnotist, as the word then wasn't, and really appears to have been so. He used his gift to entrance and dominate a friend's wife in Italy. And the story of Dickens' mesmeric sessions with Madame de la Rue is really fascinating and extremely disturbing, though not really doesn't fit into the Christmas theme. But that ability to control the mind of another person was something Dickens was fascinated by, puts into the skill set of his villain in Mystery of Edwin Drood, and very much possessed himself. Although in Dickens' case, he felt that his gift of mesmerism helped people. Dickens' alter ego in Edwin Drood, in The Mystery of Edwin Drood, is full of dark desire and takes dangerous possession of himself. And that's the same for Dickens too. His own alter ego is also full of dark desire and takes dangerous possession of Dickens. The real reason his public readings killed him was that he insisted on including a scene from Oliver Twist, even against the advice of those who loved him. The Murder of Nancy by Bill Sikes. Dickens didn't just read the scene, he performed it with a wild energy, as though he held a real cudgel in his hand and was killing anew his own creature. It was a fabulous success, but after enacting the scene, Dickens would collapse, his pulse racing. He loved acting the role for all the harm it did him. With a crazed excitement, he tempted exposure, lifted the mask, gave his adoring audience a fleeting glimpse of the darkness, the violence, the cruelty that lay beneath the beloved surface, just as he had, if less dramatically, in so many of the Christmas tales. Perhaps that all helps explain Dickens' favourite place to visit in France, a country he loved, and this also links to our Christmas theme. Indeed, he made a special trip to this place on Christmas Day just to see its residents. He loved to visit them when he was in Paris. Were they as pleased to see him? Hard to say. They were the grey, still, often mutilated bodies lying on display in the Paris morgue. Thank you for listening.
And thank you, Andrew, for that very interesting presentation. I'm going to paraphrase a couple of the comments and questions we had this evening by asking you, can we forgive Charles Dickens? Certainly you fell in love with his work as a very young man. Has what you've discovered about his life colored your readings, colored your appreciation in any way?
Well, I think he's a fascinating psychological case study. He wasn't always a kind man, there's no doubt about it, but there are so many contrasting images of Dickens. A favorite image in my mind is the story a friend told of when Dickens was walking through the streets of London, and in front of him a labourer was carrying a little cherubic baby over his back, and Dickens went into a shop and bought a bag of cherries and fed the little child silently as the man was carrying his child in front of him. The man had no knowledge of it, and it was just part of Dickens' very, very puckish and quixotic, very childlike sense of humour. But he was really childlike, and he had the infantile self-regard of a child. It doesn't mean he had enormous friendships. Some of them he broke viciously, as with his own wife. Others stayed with him till the end. People revered him who knew him. Others found him rather frightening. I don't know what any of us would have felt if we'd known him. He was that mesmeric skill he had, the dark eyes, the extraordinary power of will that he had, made him a difficult person to not fall under the spell of anyway. So I've not really answered your question.
No, not exactly, but I appreciate that. Of all of the Christmas books, the 5 Christmas books and the many Christmas stories that he published, do you have a favorite? And what would that be?
Well, I really like Mugby Junction, actually, which is as is the way with those Christmas stories that in the later years is in little parts. There are 3 chapters, one of which doesn't relate, at least 3, and they're different. They include the story of the signalman that some of you will, a ghost story, where a man is killed by ghostly forces on the railway line. But they also include this character Jackson that I was mentioning, finding a purpose in, he says that he's traveling away from his birthday. He sees no point in, he's basically lost a sense of value in life. It's a really great story, Mugby Junction. I would say I don't really like the Christmas books all that much, other than Christmas Carol, which is incredibly brilliant. It's just a pity it's so well known that we've lost a sense of the freshness of it. The best thing about Christmas Carol is Scrooge for me, and the comic figure that he puts into Scrooge, rather like Quilp in Old Curiosity Shop.
Someone questioned your introduction as being Charles Dickens' dark secret, wondering whether he had any light secrets as well. I mean,
he had many light secrets, in the sense he was a very generous man. He did care about money and he liked to make it. But unfortunately, the reading tour of America and then the United Kingdom in the last few years of his life was very much a thirst for money. He made more money from those tours, than from all of his publishing. But his light secrets, I think, would be the number of times that he did things for other people, quite silently, gave money to people who were poor, endlessly helpful for people who wrote to him, people who would write contributions to All the Year Round or Household Words. Dickens would meticulously write back very truthful and good guidance, quite unimaginable today to get that sort of attention from one of the busiest men in the world. There were many, many lovely aspects of Dickens' character that he kept quiet to himself. He did read for charitable reasons earlier in his life, rather than for his own income. So there was much kindness in Dickens too, and perhaps that's the light secret.
Did Ellen Ternan ever tell her story? What a story that would be of her life with Dickens. I know she outlived him by many years. Any
Yes.
information about that, or what would you?
Well, that is actually extraordinary. She outlived him for decades. When he died, she simply removed 13 years from her life, pretended she was 28 when she was 41, married a young Oxford graduate who thought she was 28, and I think she claimed to be Dickens' goddaughter, and that was the reason she knew anything about him. So that entire 13-year relationship was completely repressed, and the Dickens machinery around Dickens, keeping his name, not least the formidable Georgina, his sister-in-law, who became his household manager, if not more, they controlled the history like no one you can imagine. And the story of him and Ellen didn't really creep out until the 1920s, 30s. And even by the 50s, it was treated as something, it was sort of almost undignified to refer to. So Ellen never spoke to anyone about it. She did say to her to a clergyman in the village she was living in, that according to him anyway, according to the clergyman, she said that the memory of her intimacy with Dickens was loathsome to her. But whether she really said that, we don't know. Her 2 children did not know she had been the mistress of Charles Dickens, and when they were told, they were flabbergasted and upset. Told, but after her death, I think. I'm not quite sure about that. So no, she never shared that story. And incidentally, Katie, the naughty younger daughter of Dickens with lots of character, spoke very brutally occasionally about her father to a writer called Gladys Story, and she said that there are letters that to Ellen Ternan that would reveal a great deal, but those have never been found, and they've almost certainly destroyed.
I think a lot of what we've learned about Dickens' relationship with his wife Kathy, we've come to know very recently. It would certainly not have been known, though he did write his apology for his behavior to her at the time, and it was a very public thing. But Dickens' love of attention, do you think? How do you think he would feel about all the biographies that have been written, or about, in fact, your own talk this evening, if he were to hear it? Would he appreciate the attention, or would he take issue with some of the representations of him?
I think he would be really horrified that he wasn't controlling the story. When he had to stop reading, his reading tour had to be stopped on medical advice. And eventually he took the medical advice, too late, really, but he did. And when he stood down from his reading, people wrote to him either compassionately or sometimes rather sort of, we told you so, and this is what you must do immediately to save your soul, sort of stuff. And Dickens writes a rather bitter piece in Household Words about that. And I'm going to quote it because it is such a telling illustration of how Dickens would have felt about any biographer who didn't keep to the Dickens version. At one point, he writes of one interfering advisor, and this is a public thing that Dickens is writing. He thought he was in the secrets of my heart and in the lowest soundings of my soul. He, and could read the depths of my nature better than his ABC, and could turn me inside out like his own clammy glove. I'd become a glass piece of general property, and everybody was on the most surprisingly intimate terms with me. Dickens loved to be talked about, but only on his own terms.
Again, we've had a lot of questions, and I know we don't have time for too many more, but I'll combine a couple. Mary asks if you could talk about his death, and then Ellen asks if what happened to his vast fortune after he died.
Yes, well, his death was, yes. There's a seditious version that he actually died with his mistress, Ellen Ternan, possibly in the throes of passion. There is a witness who says that his body, his sick body, he was taken from Ellen's house in a carriage back to Gad's Hill, his actual residence, and there he either was already dead or he there died, having been rescued from Ellen Ternan's house so that there would be no awkward publicity. You know, imagine if someone of great fame died in their mistress's house. That wouldn't be good for the reputation. So there is a version that he was taken away from his mistress' house, I think just before he died, to die at home. The more traditional version is that he was writing in the chalet that he had built in his own grounds. He was trying to work on The Mystery of Edwin Drood, and that he came into his drawing room and collapsed and was laid out and died there and then. So his death was terrible, really, that he was only 58, though he had, I think, begun to suspect his frailty was such that he didn't have much longer to go. It was there was much mourning, and of course no one ever referred to Ellen Ternan at the time. He did, of course, to go to your second question, because in his will, the very first bequest that he makes is to Ellen Ternan, though it's a sort of neutral figure of £1,000, which would be perhaps, I don't know, perhaps 150,000 now, but not the amount you might think he would have left his lover of 12 years. However, he had bought her a house and may have made other arrangements with her. But it's interesting, she was the first person named in the will. The rest of the money went to his family, nothing, of course, to Catherine, his wife. And in fact, he includes a phrase in the will about the fact that he's already been quite generous enough to his wife by giving her an annual allowance. But the money was distributed between the children and Georgina. It was a large fortune. I can't remember what it's calculated at now, but it wasn't huge by the standards of modern wealth. I would have thought he left, by modern equivalents, probably about this is off the top of my head, about 14 or 15 million pounds, so maybe 18-20 million dollars. But an awful lot for a writer, and at the time it was a very significant bequest.
One last question then. Robert mentions that Dickens wrote a Christmas story for his children called The Life of Our Lord, and it was published long after his death. Any thoughts on that work, or?
Yes, well, it wasn't as such it was very much as with everything with Dickens. It was Dickens' version of a life. In this case, Jesus's life. Dickens' Christianity was almost certainly in earnest, but it was, as usual, of his own sort. So he was probably, well, or rather he was a Unitarian. And so he didn't like the established church. He couldn't stand evangelicals. That led to a slight rift between his beloved sister and him, because she had married an evangelical and became evangelical herself. He couldn't stand fundamentalism. He didn't really like the established church. He didn't like Roman Catholicism. Unitarianism, he liked that sense of the humanity of Christ, Christ being the sort of perfection of man, rather than the complexity of the concept of a Trinity. So the life of Christ is really, you could rename it the life of Dickens's Christ.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, let's just, I think we have to leave it there, given time. William, another listener tonight, just, I think, echoes how you began your program, in that perhaps Dickens' early poverty and lack of control over his own circumstances may have led to his later interest in control and his controlling nature. And I would add that in relation to the holiday season and his theme of forgiveness, that we need to forgive Dickens all of his human faults and foibles, and thank him for his many, many hours of great pleasure we've derived from his novels and his writing.
Yes,
and with
indeed.
that, I will say thank you once again, Andrew, and it's always a pleasure to see you.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you for listening. And I do take that last point. I think Dickens is a most wonderful writer. He's one of the greatest I've ever read. But I was really exploring his psychology rather than his great works here. But an incredible man and a wonderful writer.
And we appreciate your program tonight. It was very, very, very interesting and informative and enjoyable. Thank you. Before I turn things over to our director, Karen Karpowicz, I will remind you that our next program will be in January, Wednesday, the 17th at 6 p.m. And you can register at our website. And if you want to share this talk or any of our other talks with others, they will be available or are available on our website in recorded form. So you can watch them at your leisure and share them with your friends. And with that, let me turn things over to our director, Karen Karpowicz.
Thank you again, Andrew, and thank you for visiting us and being a friend of the ESU. I do think the complexities of Charles Dickens is probably why he is a great writer. I think that adds to the complexities of his stories, which is worth, unfortunately, not good for him, but to our advantage in understanding human nature. So thank you again for joining us this holiday season. I just want to take this opportunity to wish all of you, all of our members and our visitors today, a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. And I hope you take the joyous message of so many of Dickens' stories with you through this period. And also, this is the time of our end of a year appeal. And if you have the ability to give, please give, because giving money to the ESU allows us to run wonderful programs like this. I thank you again for your membership. I thank you again for your engagement, and have a wonderful holiday season.